Every morning, she broke the rules. For a boy she didn't know, a waitress named Eleanor Vance risked everything she had on a secret promise kept with a plate of eggs and bacon. It was an act of quiet defiance that cost her tips, her manager's respect, and nearly her job. Who was this silent boy who sat in the back of a dusty diner like a soldier on watch, with eyes that held the weight of a world she couldn't see? And why, on a calm Tuesday morning, did the entire town freeze as 4 black government SUVs, engines rumbling like distant thunder, rolled up and blocked the entrance to the Crossroads Diner? They weren't there for the boy. They were there for the waitress who fed him. This is the story of how a simple act of kindness became a matter of national honor. Ellie Vance was a woman who understood the architecture of loss. At 30, her life was a fortress built of routine, each day a brick placed precisely on top of the last, walling her off from the gaping hole her brother David had left a decade ago. He was a Marine, 20 years old, with a smile that could disarm a battalion, lost to an IED on a sun-scorched road outside Fallujah. His picture, crisp in its dress blues, was the first and last thing she saw each day. The diner was her foxhole, a place of comforting repetition, the clink of cutlery, the hiss of the grill, the low murmur of regulars. It was a life lived in the long shadow of a folded flag. Maybe that's why she saw the boy when no one else did. Not just saw him, but recognized him. He wasn't just a kid. He was a sentry. He always took the same booth, the one in the back with its back to the wall, offering a clear line of sight to the only door. He sat ramrod straight, a small, lonely soldier standing watch over a world that had seemingly forgotten him. He was a ghost of her brother. The first morning she saw him meticulously arrange his napkin and the lone glass of water, she felt a jolt of recognition. David had been like that, finding order in chaos, his gear always laid out in perfect alignment. On the third day, as she watched the boy sip his water while the scent of frying bacon taunted the air, David's voice echoed in her memory. A line from his last letter home. "You never turn your back on someone who's hungry, Elle. It's the one rule that matters out here. You just don't." That was the moment her routine shattered. It was an involuntary act, a reflex of the soul. She grabbed a plate from the pass-through window, walked over, and set it down. It was the first shot fired in a war she didn't even know she was fighting. The resistance began as a low grumble and grew louder each day. Mr. Henderson, a man who saw the world through the narrow lens of a profit and loss statement, cornered her by the coffee machine. "Eleanor, I've seen you with that kid. I can't have employees giving away inventory. It's a liability. It's against policy." His words were wrapped in the bland language of bureaucracy, but the threat was clear. She met his gaze, her own surprisingly steady. "I'm paying for it out of my tips, Mr. Henderson." His eyebrows shot up, a silent calculation of her meager earnings, but he let it go for now. The more public assault came from Gary, a fixture at the counter whose cynicism was as bitter as the black coffee he drank all day. "Feeding your stray again, Ellie?" he'd say, his voice carrying across the diner. "You're not helping him, you know. You're just making him weak. The world doesn't give handouts. It teaches hard lessons." Ellie would just pour his coffee, her hand steady, her face a mask of polite indifference. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of an argument. Arguing with a man like Gary was like wrestling a ghost. You just got tired. She was saving her strength. She had a feeling she was going to need it. There are moments that define us, not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet choice no one else sees. If you believe those are the moments that truly matter, let us know in the comments, and hit that like button to tell the world that quiet courage is the loudest voice of all. Each day became a small victory. The boy, she'd started calling him Leo in her head, began to change. The transformation was subtle, a series of small surrenders. The rigid posture softened. The constant scanning of the room lessened. One morning, he looked up as she set the plate down, and for a full 3 seconds, he met her eyes. There was a universe of pain in that gaze, but for the first time, there was also a flicker of light, a spark of trust. Then came the drawing. Left on the table, tucked under the salt shaker, was a napkin. On it, drawn in crayon with a child's unsteady hand, was a soldier. He was just a stick figure, but he was wearing a helmet, holding a rifle, and he was smiling. Ellie felt her breath catch in her throat. She carefully folded the napkin and put it in her apron pocket. It felt like a sacred text, a secret map. It was the first sign that her quiet act of defiance was more than just a meal. It was a message being sent, a connection being forged across a distance she couldn't possibly comprehend. She had drawn a line in the sand, a small perimeter of kindness in a world that felt increasingly hostile. But she was about to learn that the tide was coming in, and it was rising faster than she could have ever imagined. The napkin drawing changed the terms of the treaty. Tucked safely in Ellie's apron, it was no longer a one-sided act of charity. It was a conversation. The crude crayon stick figure of a soldier became a silent affirmation, a shared secret in a world of noise. Leo's trust, given in tiny, precious increments, became the new center of Ellie's day. A fleeting moment of eye contact that lasted a second longer than before. A slight incline of his head that was almost a nod of greeting. These were small victories, battlefield promotions in her quiet war against the indifference that surrounded them. She didn't realize that in her fight to protect him, she was slowly rebuilding the fractured walls of her own heart. Each plate of eggs she served was a brick laid in that foundation. But every fortress invites a siege, and the forces of cynicism were gathering at the gates. The rising tide of opposition was about to crest, and it would happen in the harsh light of a Tuesday morning rush. Gary, perched on his counter stool like a vulture, had been watching Ellie with a sour, simmering disapproval. He saw her kindness, not as a strength, but as a weakness in the world he understood. A world of hard knocks and pulled bootstraps. As Ellie moved down the counter with a coffee pot, he saw his opening. Leo had just finished his meal, his plate wiped clean with his usual precision. Gary swiveled on his stool, his voice a gravelly announcement meant for the whole diner. "Still feeding your little charity case, Ellie?" he boomed, a smirk twisting his lips. "I tell you, it's what's wrong with this country. Everyone's got their hand out. You'd think his parents would teach him to have some pride instead of letting him mooch off a working woman." A few heads turned. A couple of men at a nearby table chuckled. Ellie felt a familiar hot sting of anger, the one she usually swallowed down with a polite smile. But then she glanced toward the back booth. Leo had gone rigid. His head was down, his small back ramrod straight, his hands clenched into tiny fists on his lap. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a target. And in that instant, Ellie saw not the worn linoleum of a diner, but a dusty road in Iraq. She saw her brother, David, standing between a terrified child and the sneering faces of armed men. His voice from his letters echoed in her mind. "You hold the line, Elle. You always hold the line for the ones who can't." Something inside her snapped. She placed the coffee pot on the counter with a definitive, solid thud that silenced the nearest conversations. She turned and walked toward Gary, her steps measured, her gaze level. The air in the diner crackled, the ambient noise fading into a tense hum. "His name," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a tidal wave, "is Leo. He is not a charity case. He's a boy, Gary, a hungry boy. And in this diner, on my watch, no one goes hungry. Is that a problem for you?" The silence that followed was absolute. Gary, for the first time anyone could remember, was speechless. His face flushed a blotchy red, and he turned back to his coffee, utterly defeated. Mr. Henderson shot out of his office like a man escaping a fire. "Eleanor, my office, now!" he hissed, his face pale with panic. The cramped office smelled of stale cigars and desperation. Henderson didn't yell. He was worse. He was formal. He was frightened. "Eleanor, I can't have this. We had a complaint. A paying customer was made to feel uncomfortable," he said, avoiding her eyes. He slid a folded piece of paper across his desk. It was a corporate warning form, filled out in his neat, spidery handwriting. "This is a final, written warning. It's official. It goes in your file. One more incident, one more customer complaint, one more free meal I find out about, and I have to terminate your employment. The franchise agreement is ironclad. It's not me, Ellie. It's the rules." The paper felt like a block of ice in her hand. This was it. The abstract disapproval had become a concrete threat. Her job, the one thing that kept the lights on in her silent apartment, the one structure that held her life together, was now hanging by a thread. That night, the silence in her apartment was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, filled with the weight of her choice. She laid the warning slip on the table next to the napkin drawing of the little stick figure soldier. Two opposing flags from the same war. Safety versus honor. Fear versus duty. She looked at the picture of David on her nightstand. He was smiling that fearless, confident smile of a young man who believes he can change the world. He had run toward the danger, not away from it. He had held the line. She picked up the warning slip, the official corporate threat, and she saw it for what it was, a coward's shield. She folded it neatly and tucked it away in a drawer, burying it beneath old letters and pay stubs. She had made her decision. The job was just a job. Her watch over the boy in the corner was a promise. It was the only thing that truly mattered. She had held the line. But in the quiet that followed her decision, a new and colder fear began to creep in. A peace this fragile was never meant to last, and she had the terrible feeling that the quiet boy in the corner booth was running out of time. The day Ellie walked into the diner with her chin held high, ready to defend her small patch of sacred ground, the ground vanished beneath her feet. Leo's booth was empty. The silence from that corner of the room was a physical presence, a cold draft in the warm, coffee-scented air. An empty glass and a clean napkin sat on the table, a ghost of a place setting. She told herself he was sick. She made his plate anyway, a desperate act of faith, and set it on the table. It sat there all morning, a cold, uneaten monument to her fading hope. The second day, the silence from the booth was louder. The third, it was a roar. The knot of anxiety in her stomach, once a small, tight ball, began to unravel, spreading a cold dread through her veins. Had she done this? Had her public defense of him, her confrontation with Gary, somehow marked him, made him a target, forced him away? The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. The vultures began to circle. Gary's smugness was a daily performance. "Well, well," he'd chortle, loud enough for her to hear. "Looks like your little project found a new sucker. Told you they never stick around when the free ride gets complicated." Each word was a small, sharp jab. Mr. Henderson said nothing, which was worse. He just watched her, his eyes following her every move, his expression a bland mask of managerial scrutiny. He was waiting for her to break, to give him a reason. The diner, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, and she was the main exhibit. The regulars who had once offered her a kind word now looked away, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. She was utterly, completely alone. After 2 weeks, the hope finally fractured. It didn't break. It crumbled into dust. She stood before the empty booth, the clean, untouched vinyl seeming to mock her. It was over. She had been a fool. A lonely woman trying to fill the gaping hole in her own life with the imagined needs of a stranger. She had tried to be David, to hold the line, but she had failed. With a deep, shuddering breath of surrender, she picked up a wet rag from her apron. It was time to wipe the slate clean, to erase the last trace of her foolish kindness. As she leaned over the table, the smell of vinyl and stale coffee filling her senses, she felt a profound sense of defeat. This was it, the end of the story. And then the world outside the window went silent. It wasn't a gradual quiet. It was a sudden, violent amputation of sound. The sizzle of the grill, the clatter of plates, the low drone of conversation. All of it was instantly erased, as if a switch had been thrown on the world. Every customer froze. Every employee stopped. Every head in the Crossroads diner turned as one toward the front windows. 4 black Chevrolet Suburbans had pulled into the parking lot, their movements not like cars, but like a wolf pack cutting off an escape route. They were immaculate, their tinted windows reflecting the mundane world of the diner in a dark, distorted mirror. They bore official government plates. Doors opened in perfect, unnerving unison. Men in dark suits and earpieces emerged, deploying with a fluid, disciplined grace that was utterly alien to this small town. They didn't speak. They didn't gesture. They simply took up positions, creating a silent, unbreachable perimeter around the diner's entrance. The bell above the door, a cheerful thing of brass and whimsy, sounded like a single, solemn church bell as the front door swung open. A man stepped inside, and the atmosphere in the room changed from tense to electric. He was a man carved from a different kind of stone. His U.S. Army Class A uniform was so perfectly pressed, it seemed to defy the laws of fabric. His posture was a testament to a lifetime of discipline. A constellation of ribbons on his chest spoke of conflicts in places most people only saw on the news, but it was the rank on his sleeves that held the room hostage. The chevrons and rockers of a sergeant major. He was the embodiment of quiet, absolute authority. He removed his service cap, tucked it crisply under his left arm, and his steel-gray eyes began a slow, methodical sweep of the room. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for a target. His gaze passed over the terrified face of Mr. Henderson, dismissed the gawking customers, and ignored the suited men standing sentinel at the door. It moved past the counter, past the grill, and then it stopped. It locked onto Ellie. She stood paralyzed by Leo's empty booth, the wet rag still clutched in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. His voice was not loud, but it filled every corner of the silent diner. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard, a voice that carried the weight of command and consequence. "I'm looking for a woman named Eleanor Vance." And in that moment, Eleanor Vance knew that her quiet, simple life was over. What she didn't know was whether this was an execution or a salvation. Time seemed to fracture. For Eleanor Vance, the simple act of taking a step forward felt like wading through deep water. The familiar sights and sounds of the Crossroads diner, the checkered floor, the smell of old coffee, the faces of people she'd known for years, blurred into an impressionist painting of shock and fear. The only thing in focus was the sergeant major. He stood like a granite monument in the center of the room, his presence sucking all the air out of the space. Her name, spoken from his lips, was not a question, but a summons. An echo from a world of consequences she never knew she'd entered. "I'm Eleanor Vance," she managed to say, her voice a thin thread in the profound silence. The sergeant major took one step closer. His eyes, which had seen things she could never imagine, held a strange mixture of military steel and a deep human sorrow. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low and steady, meant for her but heard by everyone. "My name is Sergeant Major Cole. I was the senior non-commissioned officer for Master Sergeant Ben Carter." He paused, letting the name hang in the air before delivering the blow. "Ben was the father of the boy you've been feeding. His name is Leo Carter." A quiet gasp went through the diner. Ellie's mind reeled. Leo. He had a name. A real name. Master Sergeant Carter's unit was part of the 5th Special Forces Group, Cole continued, his report-like delivery making the facts even more brutal. He was on a deep reconnaissance mission in a hostile-controlled region. We lost contact with his team 3 weeks ago. Last week, we confirmed their status. Master Sergeant Carter was killed in action while defending his men from an overwhelming enemy force. He was a hero, ma'am. He was my friend. The finality of it hit Ellie like a physical force. The empty booth wasn't just an absence, it was a grave. The quiet boy wasn't just lonely, he was an orphan. Before he deployed, Cole's voice pressed on, relentless. Ben's wife left him. He never told command. He was too proud. He arranged for a neighbor to check in on Leo, but the neighbor moved away. Ben thought his son was being cared for. He didn't know the boy was alone. For almost 3 months, that 9-year-old boy got himself to school every day, kept the house clean, and lived on the emergency cash his father had left him, trying to make it last. He was waiting for his dad to come home. Cole's professional facade cracked for a fraction of a second, a flicker of raw pain in his eyes. He was holding the line, all by himself. He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out the worn, creased letter. Ben left this for me to give to Leo, in case the worst happened. There's a passage in it he asked me to read to someone, if I could find them. It took us 2 weeks, using his son's letters as a guide. But we found you. He unfolded the letter, the paper trembling slightly in his powerful hand. He looked directly at Ellie, and the entire diner seemed to lean in, holding its breath. He began to read, his voice now stripped of its military formality, filled only with the weight of a fallen soldier's last words. "To the woman at the diner with the kind eyes," he read, his voice catching on the words. "I don't know your name, but my son Leo does. In his letters, he calls you his friend. He tells me you give him breakfast every morning, and you never make him feel like he is a burden. You never ask questions he cannot answer. You just give him a plate of warm food and a moment of peace in a world that has offered him neither." Cole paused, taking a breath. Across the diner, a woman began to quietly weep. Gary sat hunched over the counter, his face buried in his hands. "People think honor is something you win on a battlefield," Cole continued reading. "They think it's about medals and flags, but they're wrong. Honor is what you do when no one is looking. Honor is holding a line for someone who can't hold it for themselves. You, a stranger, have shown my son the deepest kind of honor. You didn't just feed him. You gave him dignity. In caring for a soldier's son, without knowing it, You were standing watch with me. You were guarding my flank. And for that, I will be grateful for all of eternity. Whatever happens to me, know this. You kept a father's heart at peace in his final days. You let him do his duty, knowing his boy was not forgotten. The sergeant major slowly, reverently, folded the letter. He looked at Ellie, his face a mask of profound, sorrowful respect. Then, in a single, fluid motion that was both startling and beautiful, he snapped his heels together and brought his hand to his brow in a salute. It was not a casual gesture. It was a declaration. A transfer of honor from a fallen Green Beret through his ranking brother in arms to a small-town waitress. It was a gesture that bridged worlds, that connected the quiet heroism of a diner to the violent sacrifice of a distant battlefield. Behind him, every man in a suit, every soldier who had accompanied him executed the same perfect salute in unison. They held the salute, a silent, powerful honor guard for the woman who had unknowingly completed their friend's final mission. For a long moment, the only sound was Ellie's ragged breathing. Then, from the back of the room, the old man in the VFW cap pushed his chair back and slowly got to his feet. He, too, raised a trembling hand in a salute. That act broke the spell. The diner erupted, not in chaos, but in a wave of cathartic applause that washed over Ellie, a tide of respect and shame and gratitude. The days that followed were a blur. The story spread like wildfire. Mr. Henderson, his face etched with a new humility, tore up Ellie's written warning in front of the entire staff. He took down the specials board. In its place, he mounted a handsome corkboard with a small brass plaque. It read, "Master Sergeant Ben Carter's board. Leave a meal for a brother. Take a meal if you need one. We leave no one behind." Gary was the first to pin a crisp $20 bill to it. Within a week, it was covered in receipts, paid forward by truckers, by locals, by veterans who drove for miles just to see it. It became a new landmark, a testament. Ellie never saw Sergeant Major Cole again, but his promise had been kept. Leo was with his grandparents, safe and cared for. The money the unit had collected was, at Ellie's insistence, used to start a small local fund for the families of deployed soldiers. Her life was no longer silent. It was filled with a new purpose, a quiet but profound sense of duty. 6 months after the day the SUVs arrived, a small square package was delivered to the diner, addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was the American flag from Ben Carter's casket, folded into a tight, perfect triangle. Beneath it was a simple wooden frame. In it was a picture of Leo. He was standing on a fishing dock between an elderly couple, his grandparents. He was holding up a small trout, and he was smiling. It was a real smile, wide and bright, and full of a future he now had. Tucked into the back of the frame was a note written in a child's careful, determined hand. "Dear Ms. Vance," it said, "they gave me Dad's Green Beret. Grandpa says I have to earn it. Thank you for remembering me. I'll always remember you. Your friend, Leo Carter." Ellie placed the photo on the shelf behind the counter, right next to the picture of her brother. The two soldiers, one a boy in a new life, the other a young man in a memory, stood watch together. Her quiet life was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by the honor she had helped protect, and the promise she had kept. A soldier's honor is not forged only in the fire of combat. It is preserved in the quiet decency of the nation he swears to protect. A child's hope is not sustained by grand promises, but by the simple, steady presence of kindness when all else has fallen away. Eleanor Vance never wore a uniform, but she held the line on the home front. She understood in her bones what every soldier hopes for, that if they fall, the nation they fought for will remember its own. That the quiet threads of compassion, courage, and community are what truly bind the fabric of a country together. Her small diner became a testament to that truth. A testament that the greatest memorials are not made of stone, but are built from the everyday choices we make to honor the sacrifices of others. There are stories that weave the very soul of a nation. Stories of heroes in uniform, and the quiet guardians who keep their promise alive back home. These are the legacies we must protect. Subscribe to NX Incredible Stories, not just to hear a story, but to stand with us in remembering. Because in a world of noise, we will be the voice for the heroes who act in silence.